We are also lucky enough to have Maia-Mari Sutnik, who's the curator emeritus of photography at the Art Gallery of Ontario, giving the lecture today. She was the original curator of the exhibition at the Art Gallery of Ontario. In 1978, she began developing the AGO's photography collection and its program of exhibitions. As AGO's first curator of photography, she has curated and coordinated over 70 exhibitions. Among them, Robert Frank New Work, John Gutman, Responding to Photography, selected works from Toronto private collections, among many others, and more recently, Memory Unearthed, the Lodz Ghetto photographs of Henryk Ross. She has contributed to many publications and served as juror for many exhibitions and awards. And since 2005, she's been adjunct faculty at Ryerson University's Image Arts graduate program in film and photographic preservation and collections management. Please join me in welcoming Maia-Mari Sutnik.
Thank you very much, Kristen, and I'm very honored and pleased to be here. I spent some time in this wonderful, wonderful museum, and I must say I'm envious for all the treasures that many of you have an opportunity to see and visit on a regular basis. I want to just give you sort of an overview that about the collection and what this collection means to us in the photography world, and hopefully to those people who have an opportunity to see the exhibition. So I want to start with this particular image that you see, which is essentially the 2 months after the Lodz Ghetto had been liberated by the Red Army. Henryk Ross, with his wife Stefania, and friends unearthed the 35mm negatives that he had buried in the ghetto's ground on the Jerienska Street. So during the final days of the liquidation of the ghetto in August of 1944, Ross did so wanted to preserve the memory of the Jewish community. And he thought that if he were not to survive the deportations, his document of the grim reality would somehow find a way to tell the story of the Jewish residents endured during the German National Socialist regime that occupied Lodz from 1940 to 1945. Half of Ross's negatives that were buried have now a very powerful visible record of the spectrum of the historical period, and which was certainly one of the most harrowing in Europe at the time. Lodz was the second largest and certainly the longest standing ghetto in which Jews were incarcerated. The Ross collection of negatives at the Art Gallery of Ontario, compiled of documents, personal notes, clippings, official ghetto notices, and many other sort of a photographic evidence assembled by Ross during the time that he was confined to work for the Jewish Administration Statistics Department. And I'm going to... Oops, okay. As a working photographer for the Judenrat, the Jewish Council, the governing body of Jewish affairs within the ghetto walls, Ross's primary task was to photograph and make prints of the thousands of residents, the required photographic ID for the ghetto's growing population. He very cleverly stockpiled film and devised a technique to record several subjects in the same image and crop the individual's faces for the ID cards. And you can see in this one that he has this sort of a technique of everyone being separated, and then once he got the negative, he would cut out the individual faces, which means that only on the one film or the one negative, he was able, in this case, I guess, to get 7 or 8 individual portraits. Subsequent assignments included documenting official events, ghetto administrative services, and labor, essentially to create images that showcase the Jewish productivity for the German administration. His negatives reveal that he not only witnessed within a short time the rapid deterioration of the ghetto, but as a photojournalist he saw and had certainly felt more than the unfolding of the abysmal tragedy. He also sought out moments that were important to capture: birthdays, weddings, family gatherings, children at play. As we see later, these became the moments of resistance to the weight of the daily assaults and the ordeals that the Jewish community were subjected to in order to lose their dignity. The historiography of events of the Holocaust are available in volumes, and the topic certainly has entered into the academic discipline of its own. But since collective memory has entered through our survivors, an individual written many individual accounts, diaries, testimonies, letters, notes, and scraps of paper, all reveal the grim realities of the Holocaust. At the same time, certainly photographs are also part of that indelible record. So on September the 8th, 1939, a week after occupying Poland, the German army also occupies Lodz, and shortly afterward burns and destroys the synagogues, leaving nothing but rubble. You can see the rubble of these are pretty much the destruction, not only of synagogues, but also the buildings adjacent to it. Fear, certainly, and brutality and persecution is meted out to individuals, Jews as well as non-Jews that were felt that did not meet up to the Aryan expectations, were deemed worthless, and a great period of personal risk. Ross attempted to capture such inhuman treatments. I'll show that. Even though, as one sees, that this particular image was just underdisposed and certainly photographed under very difficult conditions. While darkness and uncertainty loomed over the ghetto, people carried on with certain kind of optimism. Ross married Stefania Stronberg in 1941, and Ross even depicted a humorous caricature of the fancy wedding that they didn't have. Ross was, in addition to being a photographer, had a very creative streak, and there are numerous examples of his graphic skills in the collection of the Art Gallery of Ontario. Also important was a continuation of family relationships. You can see that being loving was not to cast aside, and it was important for residents who experienced trauma and had to leave their homes and to be forced into the ghetto, that they did not degrade themselves and they maintained a self-image of themselves, of normality. You have to remember that the people that were forced into the ghetto were businessmen, they were creative artists, they were writers, they were successful people, and once they entered the ghetto, it was very important for them to maintain, I felt, this sense of dignity. And Ross was photographing in the early days from 1940 to 41, where they still had certain kinds of clothing and they did not look as despaired. However, I think it's very important then to understand, where his negatives become very, very important. So this is a picture that has been often miscaptioned, and it's read in one publication that it was titled "The Protected Children of the Dignitaries," meaning that these were the protected children of the Jewish administration. However, what the study has shown that Ross's negatives reveal a very different story. And this is where the value of the negative reveals its own authority. As material objects, they are often untapped for their capacity as historical objects of analysis. Ross's negatives are in fact the primary document, and not only as the force for the print, but also a source for reproductions which may exist in various formats. But significantly, they show how negative is connected to other negatives and throws light upon the narrative. So I just want to show this one, that this particular image can be sort of dated from as 1942, when the early deportations were beginning, and because we still see a bit of a garden here, and we will get to this garden image in a while. So this particular work, I worked with a student, Lindsay Bolanis, one of the graduate students at Ryerson University program of photographic preservation and collections management. And her study shows the value of the negative and the focus on the unique qualities. which brought forth components in reconstructing the story of the Jewish community in Lodz through Ross's act of photographing. With analysis of every fragile nitrate-based negative, it is revealed that Ross used 11 different types and brands of film, which is suggested that he certainly did not have a steady supply or consistency on film. Film also, when processed, reveals traces of processing and also certain imperfections. We are more likely to see what happens when working under these kind of conditions. So when you look at these negatives, we can then tell by looking at the emulsions that are brought together which strips of negatives are sequential and run in a sequence. So certain telltale marks on a negative often identify these individual frames. So this boy that's strayed on the street, we have the negative. We also have a contact print, which you see next to it. And the print made by Ross in Lodz of the crinkled edge image. That's right, the crinkled edge paper that's available to him. So we can compare subsequent uses of the image in his book, The Last Journey of the Jews, which was printed around 1961 in Israel. And the interesting thing in that book is that he actually crops out the boy on your, I guess it's on your left. So we have actually in the exhibition the full image. So it's just to demonstrate that photographs have a way of being able to be mediated and to be shown. In the book, also he shows just that boy, and it fits onto a page to show other disasters and deaths on the street, certainly to heighten the conditions that were going on in the ghetto at the time. Also, in the back of the photograph, we can know that this is actually a print from the Lodz Ghetto because he has identified it at the back with his photographer's stamp. We can also tell that, as I was mentioning before, that pretty much all of the photographs that he was able to process in the ghetto itself have this particular, they're very small and they have this very particular characteristic of these sort of crinkled edges. And this shows a view of the German authorities inspecting the ghetto. I actually think that I have found Himmler on it, but it's not something to be particularly proud of, but he is in there, I believe. So we can also distinguish Ross's original work by looking at this particular image, which shows the young Zionist garden and sort of a scarecrow. So this sort of shows the sequence in which how he transported his film, and so the transport of the camera reveals certainly the sequences and how they match up into the events. This shows the young Zionist agricultural workers tending to a garden, but it is also known in the events of the ghetto that this would have been around 1940-41, when the residents were still allowed to grow food. The rest of the image, of course, of the scarecrow is quite a powerful image because it shows the Star of David, which became obligatory for Jews in December of 1939. It also is a reminder, certainly, of the isolation of the Jewish inhabitants in the ghetto. The following image then shows the surgery in the hospital, and this is a number of images at the strip. So it can, again, we know that in the sequences of work, which corresponds to the timeline of the Zionist workers, we can also then look at the surgery that we know that also it would have been around the same time period. And so what makes this important is that it demonstrates also that we know that all of these areas and all of these services were pretty much closed down because of the number of Jews that were moved from Western cities into Lodz. Some 20,000 Jews arrived around in between November and December in 1941, and they were displaced, the hospitals were there displaced and curtailed. So what this does is that it reveals the life as it was happening in the ghetto. It shows, the side that Ross photographed, which was to look at the life as it was sort of unfolding, but at the same time, he was doing what are considered the propagandist photographs for the Jewish administration who would give them to the Germans to show the productivity, and in this case, the making of the luxury goods that are being sold for the German market. You know, we have to remember in 1942-43, the Germans still had a certain amount of money, and life was pretty well off for the Germans, particularly the Nazis in Berlin. So doing the luxury goods at the same time, it shows the workers in the textile. You see there's row and row of people, men sewing in the textile factory. So these became the sort of the photographs to show the working Jew. And Ross then simultaneously worked doing what he felt was the sort of the work that was what I considered the veiled kind of theatrics. Because we see that here you have these Jewish administrations sitting behind desks. They're sitting, both of these pictures were taken behind the same desk. We have them just posing different groups. The shelves are empty. This is the food distribution center, and there isn't really much to distribute, you know. But, you know, this was sort of a very important for people just to pose and to show a sense of sense-worth, even in this kind of a bleak point of reality. So to be photographed was important because I think it was showing that they were an orderly community, which was something that they had to show all the time, and which was something that was required, even though at the same time we know that hanging scenes were going on, people were being persecuted, and everybody lived in fear. So I think that sort of I'm going to jump ahead a number of years to when you ask the question, you know, what was the resistance, you know, under all of these daily threats, you know, and how did people manage to survive and live through these years? And I came across in the research this very interesting article that appeared in 1957 in an issue called Rimon, which is an Israeli publication. And it shows this photograph, and I should actually go back. It tells the story of this particular man, and I'm going to quote. "Few are the images of the Holocaust as symbolized in shocking simplicity the loss of millions as the photograph of the religious Jew, a resident of the Lodz Ghetto who posed before his likely death, clutching a Torah scroll to remember forever. This photograph was taken by Henryk Ross, a photojournalist who had survived the ghetto, who exploited his official position to record secretly for posterity this moment in human history." The writer then continues, "It was during one of the liquidations that Ross surprised the frightened Jew and photographed him from behind." This is the preview. "Hearing the sound of the camera, the man turned and trembled with fear. He was sure that behind him was the Gestapo in civilian clothes, who had come to kill him. But Ross explained his fear was unfounded, that he was photographing for history. The man then stood up on a pile of rubble. Stood up on the pile of rubble. If it's for history, take another picture, but make it a good one." And so I think it's interesting to see how this image obviously, survived in Ross's collection of photographs, but then how it is also used on the cover of this particular magazine. It has been reversed, but it's very important to know that at the same time that pictures have stories to tell that are certainly deeply embedded. And I think that it's these kind of moments that tell us so much about the resilience and the resistance that the population of Lodz endured. So it's deeply, sort of a telling of the historical condition and the resilience. Susan Sontag, who once expressed that photographs are certainly unreliable documents, but also stated that when it comes to remembering, the photograph has a deeper meaning. And I feel it's important to touch upon the veracity of photographic images as it was conveyed to me during an exhibition in Toronto by a blogger. He actually said that the Ross's photographs were all fakes. So this is an argument one simply I would step aside and let these kind of annoying claims dissipate. However, as a photographic historian and a curator, one is aware that photography's affiliation with the real world is very demanding. The photograph forms the traces of the world, delineating and pausing reality. At the same time, its extraordinary power the photograph possesses becomes evident, and it is perhaps its subjectivity that is the most potent quality. It is a point of view, and I think one must remember that. And this distinct freedom of the medium suggests to me that subjectivity, and not necessarily being unbiased or being unvarnished reality, is just as important to understand. So the photographer provides a viewpoint that forms layers in our consciousness and in our memory. So I think we always have to ask the questions, who took this picture? What were the circumstances? What am I looking at? What is it that I see and what is it that I don't see? So it's very important when I'm looking at this particular image, and it's in the exhibition, that a certain amount of questions arise. Ross was open-eyed to the events in the ghetto, and at the same time as he witnessed the evacuation of the children that were being sent to Chalmo to be killed in the death camp, he photographed this family portrait that elicits certain kind of emotion. This series shows Ross photographing versatility. The sequence of a husband and wife and infant is emphatically composed to reveal tenderness and loving interaction. The image centers on a cherished, well-bundled child, but this emotional series also conveys a very haunting aura. It reminds one to ask, what is revealed by this family reunion? Or alternatively, what can one extrapolate from existing knowledge of the events that cast this moment into a different light? Does the fact that the thousands of children were torn from their homes call into question the conscience of this family, still united within the harrowing events of the ghetto? On the other hand, the scene may hold another revelation. The family could be stuck by fearful anticipation. When the few parents volunteered to give up their offsprings to the Jewish police, and the Gestapo stepped in to fulfill the quota for the children. Ross may have captured his family in the moment of adoration or in a moment of fear. The husband is a member of the Judenrat, and you can tell this from the hat that he's wearing. He is an empowered police officer, but we are not certain that he is still protected. The man lovingly touches his infant's chin. His policeman hat obscures the face and expression, and also hides his wife, who might be whispering something into his ear. This is an affectionate, emotional moment, but the series also shows the mother clutching the child very fiercely. So the question really becomes, is this an ultimate scene of drama, of loss, or impending loss? The Nazi administration was determined to implement the quota for resettlement to the fullest. If in face of the relentless quest for numbers, if they were not fulfilled, deportation to the death camp was a threat to everyone, regardless of social status. Everyone's life was in peril. So there are many questions about the Holocaust historians are grappling with, and it is perhaps best not to have all the answers, for if we step and stop questioning, I think then we have a difficulty. Peter Sells, in the book called The Art of Social Conscience, discusses the value of art as an expression of morality, stating that humanity must essentially be learned and fought for. And it is often the artist who becomes the individual to whom the struggle manifests itself. Sells suggests that the work of art can alleviate humankind's alienation and act as an instrument to achieve greater freedom and dignity. Which brings us to Ross as a photographer and his role in this endeavor. Ross had worked as a photojournalist in Warsaw, and he served briefly in the Polish army in 1939 when the army lost to the German invasion. he was forced into the Lodz Ghetto. Working there in the statistics department at first, as I mentioned, doing identity photography, Chaim Mordecai Rumkowski placed in the position as the eldest of the Jews of the Jewish Council, which was a self-administrating council reporting to the German authorities. See, he saw value in establishing a photographic department in 1941. So Ross, who's in this picture on this side, you see him standing there with a mustache. Sitting next to down is Mendel Grossman, and next to him is another photographer, which has not been mentioned very often, but was Leib Maliniak. And the others I have not been able to identify. But they were assembled together with the purpose of documenting official events, which included activities of Rumkowski himself, of course, and the proof of an orderly and a productive community of Jews for the Germans. So this next picture shows that Ross is photographing Mendel Grossman, who is again photographing, showing the project activity while they are actually digging out a sewage pit, or a pit for waste and disposal, maybe a better word for it. Rumkowski, there seen amongst the ghetto residents, consolidates his power with food distribution, health and welfare services, and follows with a number of ordinances by setting up a post office. This is in 1940 when the ghetto was being renamed Lynchmannstadt after a German general. They designed postage stamps, which was, this one was actually designed by Ross. And it shows the sort of the emblematic activities that he visualizes in the ghetto. There is a bridge, which I'll show later a picture of, that divided it. You can see at the lower right the sentry, which is isolates the ghetto, and of course people working and being productive. So among the many sort of graphic designs that we actually have in the collection, it's interesting to see how the kind of materials that we have, the money that was it was made for the Lynchmannstadt, where they had their own money, all of it being worthless, actually even within the ghetto itself, and much so outside of the ghetto. But he also sets up a fire brigade, and then the Jewish police. And in order to fulfill the German commissioner's requirement for what he calls an orderly community. So in the beginning, street trade, is permitted. We see this little boy with his few little wares trying to sell, and but food certainly comes in short supply, and there's illness and hunger and lack of health care. And collection of bodies, as Ross has documented through a number of strips, is pretty evident that the conditions of the ghetto are certainly deteriorating. So one of the official duties that he had was also to take pictures of the dead, which were then assigned numbers so that they could subsequently be identified for photographs as the bodies were being disposed. So this is the collection of the bodies. This is another picture taken in the morgue, and then this very sad and tragic picture of a young Jewish boy. So Ross had to, at the same time as doing these productivity pictures that were the propagandists, also had the horrible situation of having to photograph the bodies, which were actually required by the German so that they could account for every individual. So the conditions of the ghetto are disintegrating quickly. It was actually sealed off from the outside world, and you can see from this sign that is restricted for Jews and nobody else is allowed to enter. There are wire fences. There is sentry guards, and inside the ghetto proper, 3 levels of the German police are actually there, the Kripo, the Gestapo, and the Schupo, which increases fear and always fear of imprisonment. The residents then are divided the ghetto is split into two. There is an Aryan-only street that runs through the ghetto, and so the Jews had to build this bridge to cross from one side to the other. So Rumgansky certainly rules with an iron hand, controlling food. And I just thought I'd show that this is a kind of a photograph of a painting that shows his grandiose position there, where he's sort of saving the children and saving the inhabitants. At the same time, there are the bridge again in the background, and him kind of being the heroic of the masses. But in the early days, matzos are still allowed to be used in the bakery, but that is also prohibited after a while. And as the population from Western Europe are forced into the ghetto, you can see that there's a huge, tremendous crowding. Food delivery is rationed out, and while we can look at a huge wagon here of bread, it hardly is there to feed some 70,000 people that's increasing every day. There is a wonderful and interesting story to read about the sad potatoes that all arrived rotten and were kind of frozen. On the other hand, as the load of potatoes was discarded and thrown into the ground, next year they actually sprouted, and people in fact had some edible potatoes to eat. So certain tragedies have some kind of a benefit. Thank goodness to the potato's ability to sprout. However, the ordinances that continued in the ghetto were pretty serious. As you can see, that food was handed out individually into little tin cans or tin sort of pails, as you see for this man. And then at the same time, all valuables that were required, and this is a photograph of somebody turning in their medals or whatever they deemed to be worthy. So the ethics of the work production was the most important things, that the people could not technically sort of look after themselves, that they were going to be totally dependent on working as a slave labor camp and produce material. Leather was one of the big products that allowed for making of boots for the German army, so there was a huge leather factory, and there's a whole sequence with Ross photographing that particular production and how the leather was made and how it was dyed and how it was then softened and how the boots were finally made in the end. And the other big industry at the time was mattresses. The women worked in this force, and in the exhibition you will see there's a series of these images which shows how these mattresses are filled from wood shavings that were extremely, extremely fine, almost like they were kind of dust. Horrible conditions to work under in terms of what you're breathing in, and then they're stuffed into to make mattresses for the German army, and then of course you see these are piles of them being shipped off. And at the same time, the ghetto has no more running water, and there's no use of electricity is curtailed. You see there are notices in the exhibition that actually make references to, and one of the other things that one was able to piece together the photographs of Ross along with was looking at the notices, because the notices were almost daily and they are dated. And so you can take what the notices talks about food rations, and you can then compare them and you can match them up with a number of the images that we find actually on the negatives. And this is, of course, one of the most difficult images. There is a series. This was working on the fecal wagons, and which certainly was an uncertain death because of the outbreak of typhus and disease. So this working in this labor certainly was a death sentence for anyone involved. So the dismal conditions also, of course, lead to the deportations. And they are accelerating throughout 1942. You will see here they are at the this is a gate where the people are walking out. They still have allowed a certain amount of baggage with them, bags with some clothing or something, which of course in the end they never get an opportunity to use. And we know from subsequent pictures that some of this is returned to the ghetto later, at which time the inhabitants are beginning to understand that these so-called resettlement programs were in fact death sentences, that they were all killed in the gas vans at Chelmo. You will see the families are being separated. Children are separated from their parents. You can see this, picture with this elderly woman. And so, the number of victims accelerated, and the deportations are close to about 60,000 people that are sent off to die in the mobile gas vans in Chelmo, which is about 70 kilometers outside of Lodz. On September the 4th is what there's called the Gesper, which was the big curfew. And this was the deportation, where Rapowski pleads in a speech where he says, "Give me your children." And this is in response to the Germans requesting some 20,000 Jews to be eliminated. The aged, the ill, and the children under 10 are all deemed to be, as it says, useless mouths to be fed. So the deportations and the roundups, this is actually when the lists are being read out, and this is, of course, where the Jewish police is seen as implicated in these deportations because they're reading out the names of people to be sent. You can see already a couple of children, they're certainly under the age of 10, gathering around. But the situation there is, of course, that we all know that if they don't follow these particular orders, then the Gestapo would set in, and actually they did. So the roundup was a combination of the German authorities as well as the Jewish police. We see this picture that Ross took where the sick are being removed from the hospitals. We see this elderly man, I think, sitting in as dignified as he possibly be, wondering, or probably knowing that this is the end of his life. We see this, elderly woman again with all her belongings. I mean, everything that she owns is probably on her body. And we see this very well-known, very documented photograph of this pain that is registered in this face in this overcrowded wagon that is taking them to Chelmo. And then this is a picture that is probably the most disheartening because this is the young children. And, you look at it at first, you wonder, what is it this are about? They're not on a wagon ride of happiness. I mean, interesting thing is there that everyone except the one boy is looking at the photographer, and you can kind of see even the horse is bedraggled, and you can closely, in juxtaposition, there is somebody surviving on the street that is already a young person, because he's wearing these type of clothing that young boys used to wear, that he has been, at this moment, been saved. So the most insidious way, of course, of luring these voluntary individuals was the promise of food. And if you remember the earlier picture I showed of the children sitting that I said has been often mistitled and miscaptioned, those were actually children who they had tags around their necks, and they had been lured down because of promise of food. So once they got the food, they were fed. They looked, fairly happy in there because they're children, they're innocent, but they were victims more than anything else. So all of this terror is, critically captured by Ross as he anticipated the total elimination of Jews from the Lodz Ghetto by the Nazi executioners, and that is his words. So a short settlement settles in 1943 with the population reduced to approximately 87,000, and Rapowski's workforce continues to generate profit for the German war economy. As rumors spread over the German losses and the Red Army is approaching, Heinrich Himmler decrees for the Lodz Ghetto to be liquidated, and mass deportations begin in August of 1944. So Ross manages with assistance, these are the beginnings of the deportations, and you can see the hordes of people, and they have to walk to the Radagast station, which was situated on the outskirts of Lodz Ghetto, which was actually off limits for them under normal circumstances, but of course now they're being all hoarded into this deportation, which they are being all told still is a resettlement, or they're going to be sent to concentration camps. Ross manages with a friend of his to dress up as a cleaner and hides into a shed to photograph the cattle car transport, and this time the transport is to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Rumkowski and his family are included. And some more of the risks that actually shows that Ross was undertaking, because if he had been discovered in it, there was certainly, he would have been shot. You can see some of the German officers there and how the people are being pushed and hoarded into it. I mean, he describes the event about the brutality that actually took place at the same time, because I think people at that time realized that what the real truth was. So Ross and photographs some of the remains of Lodz. You can see these, pails and pails, which were actually the implements that people used and were fed from and had to eat from. The city is certainly left in kind of a rubble. There isn't much left. The Red Army comes in and liberates them. That creates further complications, of course, later on, because when the communists take rule over Poland, the Jewish treatment does not really improve very much at all, and they're all still wondering and living, what is this rule going to do to our livelihoods, how are our lives to be affected by the new rule? So he also photographs this liberation moment, because these are the Jews then, for the first time after 4 or 5 years, outside of the ghetto gates. So they're standing underneath the sign that prohibited the entry of anybody else other than the Jews. So this is one of his liberation photos. Hans Bieber. So the interesting thing is that Hans Bieber, who was the German general administrator, was greedy, and it was also his greed that actually led to the survival of some 877, certainly registered individuals. Hans Bieber's, prospect was that there were hidden goods, that the Jews had been hiding treasures and things in the tables of in the legs, and that they were in the walls. And he then kept back a cleaning crew, out of which included Ross. And but as the Red Army had came in, and it made it very clear that his days were numbered, and so he left. At the same time, he had some of the German soldiers dig a pit outside on the outskirts, because the remaining Jews that he had considered as a cleanup crew were to be shot. And today I was reading that actually those markings in the ground are still there, and they have not been retouched or touched in any way. That's been sort of kept as a reminder. So Ross then stays on in the ghetto. He tries to open up a business, in photography business, with a partner, but the communist regime is, of course, not very forthcoming or very encouraging of him to have any independent kind of activity, and so he seeks to get entry into Israel. Israel was the only country to which Jews from Poland could emigrate to, although some were successfully able to get to Sweden and some of the other countries, but for the most part, Israel was the sort of the only hope. He immigrates to Israel with Stefania in the middle of the 1950s, which believed was 1956, but I've come across now letters while he's in Israel in 1952, where he's asking about his negatives. And as it turns out that when the communists entered Lodz Ghetto, he was certainly not aware or didn't know what was going to happen to his historical record. And through a diplomatic pouch through Warsaw, he sent it to Israel to a corresponding diplomatic services. And so by 1950, he must have gotten permit to enter Israel, because in 52, there's this correspondence where he's asking and seeking for his negatives. They are restored, and he does mention that it was thankful to Ben Gurion that he was able to locate this material. And it is then when he also begins to try to reconstruct his own narrative and his own time in the ghetto. But in 1961, on May the 2nd, he testifies at the Eichmann trial. And his photographs helped to prosecute the perpetrator of certainly of the Holocaust's the greatest evil. And Ross then begins to gain a certain new kind of confidence about the value of his work, and he begins to reconstruct the narrative of his experience. He gets a certain amount of attention for having being a witness, and you will see there's a story here, and it reproduces a number of the images from the Lodz Ghetto at the time. So with his newfound confidence, he feels that his work will be largely understood and better appreciated. He sets about to write his own narrative. And this is probably, when I came across this folio, as you see in the exhibition, I was so thrilled because I thought, oh, you know, like most photographers, they sequence their images, and I will have a wonderful sequence on what was happening in the ghetto in a systematic way. However, this was not the case at all. And this is where I was talking about the importance of the negatives, because it's the negatives that actually show how he photographed, and we can then match them in with the timelines, the particular events that he was capturing. This body, this sort of a construction that he does here is so complicated and so difficult to figure out. But I think it becomes a narrative of his sort of a personal experience and the memories of things that he remembers from the Lodz. It is such a complex way of, and very unsettling at the same time, because I think when one looks and peers at it very closely, there is absolutely no chronology. I mean, in the middle of these few rows, you already see a liberation, and then you see it's cut up and renumbered with 35 millimeter contact print numbers, none of it really corresponding to the actual negative numbers that we've been able to see actually on the film itself. So, you know, one kind of wonders, or at least I wondered, why he would do this. And I don't have a real answer for it. I asked the photographer to write an essay in the catalog, which is called The Final Edit. And this photographer had actually worked under conditions in Nicaragua that were very traumatic. And so I thought that he might be able to do some kind of a reading and understanding on what is that Ross is trying to tell us. And I think what comes out of this folio pages is a selective assembly by Ross. You know, it's his memory as it evokes certain days, the experiences, you know, for the moment. I mean, every day might have been the same way. You wake up, you don't know what your assignment is, you're cold, there's no food, you're trying to survive somehow by your own wits. He's got assignments to do, he's witnessing this death camp of Lodz Ghetto, essentially, this work camp, people being deported, and he is doing his job as a photographer, trying to tell a story. And I think this sort of a reconstruction, this very complicated folio, is really a state of his mind when he's trying to reconstruct this in Israel. He worked there as a syncographer. He did have a family. And so I think that a coherent story for Ross, having lived the trauma of the Lodz Ghetto, was really too much. So these singular selective images and their placement would only evoke the memory. So collectively, I think Ross's negatives authenticate the many deep revelations that we've been able to find and construct, and many that seem to challenge him within the years that he left behind. So he seems to be searching for individual memories, attempting to locate the heart of his story, and I think it's one of resilience and commitment to creating a historical record and remembering Lodz and its people. So I don't know if I guess there is some time. I have some additional images that I want to show and to kind of round out the type of photography that Ross undertook. So this particular image that you see in the exhibition is certainly a tongue-in-cheek resistance to the ordinance that the photographers were only allowed to do official pictures. There's a notice you see on the wall that tells you that they can't do anything other than officially approved pictures. But you see a huge photographic lens. He used a Leica camera, so there's a Leica lens. Hanging in front of it is a kind of a ball and chain, which is attached to the legs of one of the photographers. You see Mandel Grossman there carrying these pictures of Lodz Ghetto under his arm. Then there Lieb is there kind of blotted out at the very bottom. But the man on the ladder is Ross. And there is a very funny statement I came across where he says that when he was photographing, he was climbing ladders and hiding from the Germans. And and then when you look at his pictures, it becomes pretty evident that for a lot of the group pictures that he took, he was actually high up in order to get the whole group up, because the kind of the lens he had and the type of photography he was doing, it was important to be high up to gather the whole group. So this kind of a picture that seems, actually needs an explanation, and I believe that there is one in the exhibition, is again a kind of a picture that shows the resistance as the way that photography was used. So this picture that is not in the exhibition, but is in the book. And we received a call from a woman who lives in Laval, just outside of Montreal, Quebec, and said that she was absolutely astonished to find her father in this picture and her mother. And the child, it is her, about 2.5. And so this is the kind of a remarkable story. Her name was Stopniki at the time, and her father was working in distributing out food, and particularly the potatoes, and that that humorous story about rotten potatoes that actually helped to save some people's lives for a period of time. So she sees. So there's a whole sequence of pictures that show Mr. Stopniki and his daughter and with some other friends. So we've been then able to supply to them, copies of these prints to have, because they're much cherished. Also, that At the same time as he was doing these family portraits and family pictures, which would, as I mentioned before, would have been in the early days of the ghetto when people still had and were not totally, had some, clothing and were not threadbare. He did, sort of document the optimism in it, which was that, there was going to be a lot of food. We see these big kettles there. This is the kitchen staff of the hospital. And as I mentioned before, the hospitals were sort of closed and shut down. The ill people were removed, sent off to the gas vans. And other people that were moved in from other Jews that were moved in from other parts of Europe, were taken and needed that particular space. But amongst all of this, it's just to show that Ross, was very much of a photographer in terms of having, great photographic skills. I think that he wanted to show beauty. I mean, this is a young bride. And I said, the gloom that existed throughout their lives was certainly punctuated with people looking for opportunities. I mean, we know that in the early days they had theater, they had musicians, and then yesterday somebody was here singing some of the Lodz Ghetto songs. So, people sought out for whatever they could in order to show that, their dignity had to remain intact. I mean, I think this is, people being, a loving couple. Maybe they're married, maybe they're engaged. I mean, they look optimistic. They want to live. They want to survive. And you have this picture that Ross took. He loved photographing in an area called the emeritus, which was not highly inhabited, but had some vegetation. So there are photographs of him and the children and people climbing trees and playing and being joyful for these kind of moments of which I call, sort of consolation moments. But at the same time, for people criticizing him for doing the joyous and the happy moments and the families, he was also critical. I mean, this picture is very evident he shows that there is certain privilege within the ghetto. There are the privileged police walking away with bags of food, and you can certainly see the despairing pose by the elderly man looking, who does not have any food and probably won't have any for the day. So, his eye was, I think, extremely alert to what was going on. He was, after all, a photojournalist. And, it's an instinct of the photojournalist, if you're a good one, to look at everything and to be there, to tell the story. And this was, one of his aims. He also went to the cemetery, did a series of pictures of people that had died. I mean, the number of people dying out of starvation was horrendous. That was one of the disease and illnesses were rampant because of the conditions under which they lived. I was learning that he had a strong affection for photographing children. I mean, this young sort of street urchin, this is the early days of the ghetto, of course, when she was allowed to sell whatever she's in there, whatever they were able to manage, hoping that she would make enough to have some provisions for the day. And again, I think this picture is in the exhibition. I had a doctor who looked at this and said, well, this child certainly has rickets, judging by the way her legs were formed. But I think it's, to me, it's a very, very powerful image on how the adult hand is reaching out to the child, and that this is a moment between a parent and the child, and these moments were rare, and that Ross was there to remember that there was this desire to be normal, to be treated with dignity, and to be respected as Jews. There's a picture here of his wife, Stefania, and we find that Ross was very innovative. I mean, this is a kind of a picture that, there's two pictures in one. So he used a lot of mirrors, so you could see the person from a different perspective. And so there are a series of photographs he did of Stefania, who certainly was his muse, and then later on certainly protected him while he was out on the streets photographing. I think in the early days it wasn't necessary because he had a certain amount of freedom, but as life and conditions were becoming abysmal and disintegrating, and the presence of the Jewish police was more active, she was out there to look out for him. Stefania, she worked in the kitchen, so she talks very honestly about the fact that, yeah, I did feel for food. There was no question about it. She said because in order for him, for Ross to get film later on, which became very difficult, he bartered that with actually the guards. And what we're also forgetting that many of the German guards who were there didn't actually know themselves where their next a loaf of bread was coming from, so they could easily be blackmailed or helped out. So there was a kind of a black market going on, which it certainly helped for the survival of many. So this is in the exhibition. You will see there is a what I call a kind of a memorial wall of people that all perished, and I think this is the last picture, and it kind of sums up again to, interestingly enough, that though these negatives deteriorated and degraded while they were buried in the ground, that throughout faces seem to have remained. And I think that's sort of kind of miraculous, that somehow, in spite of everything, the human spirit, somehow the face of the human spirit survived these negatives. And I think this child certainly is emblematic of that situation. So I'm going to close with this, and if you have some questions, I think we have ample time for that. I'd be very happy to respond if I can.
There are microphones on either side of the room if anyone has questions.
Can you talk a little bit more about how he buried his negatives and how they were found and then brought to Israel?
In 1944, when the deportations were being announced, he was pretty convinced that everyone was going to be evacuated and sent off to extermination camps. And he put his negatives into a jar, which was supposed to have iron in it to somehow protect it, or maybe steel. On the other hand, for the 7 months that they were in the ground during the winter, moisture seeped into it, rusted, I would imagine, some of the metal that he refers to it as iron. I think it was just steel or just tin or whatever. And in March, when the ground had defrosted, he then went with some friends to dig up the negatives. So that's how he retrieved the negatives. As you know, the ghetto then was liberated in January, and they were under communist rule, and it was, of course, some concern to Ross on what to do with this, what he considers the historical record of the martyrdom of the Jews of Lodz. And I think it took him some time, obviously, to figure out on what to do, because no one knew neither what was happening. I mean, were the communist regime going to be any different than what they had experienced for almost 5 years? There was no way of telling.
I'd be interested in knowing a little more about the equipment he was using, because clearly he didn't have time to set something up on a tripod the way we typically see photographers of the era. So if you would comment on that, I'd be interested. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a nice question. He was working with a Leica camera. It's probably one of the most versatile cameras. It came on the market in 1927, 28. I mean, that had been a few models before, but certainly photojournalism was a savior for photojournalists because it was small. It had wonderful lenses, which is one of the reasons I showed you that picture that he does where the lens becomes part of that constructed montage image. So you saw in the early beginnings there was a picture of him taking the people for the ID photographs. He is on a tripod then because at the time he wanted a longer exposure so that he would be sure that he had good focus. When he was later on, he cut that picture up for the individual ID portraits. So that was just he was very, I think, intuitive in how he worked. And certainly he did use the ladders when he was climbing up to do, to do some of the group photographs because he wouldn't able to do it otherwise. But there was very limited equipment. I mean, the Leica, as you know, has been used with all kinds of photographers. I mean, if you think of Cartier-Bresson and Cortege, and it's been a photojournalist's kind of a savior.
Can we assume that the pictures he buried were the ones that were taken furtively, that were not commissioned necessarily? And did any of his ID photos survive?
He buried everything, the official pictures and the pictures that he took on his own instinct that needed to be photographed. So all the negatives that we have show traces of some form of deterioration, some form of emulsion, breaks, some sort of cracking. So when we look at the individual strips, it also includes, there are some that are very well preserved, depending on where they were, I suppose in the box that he buried them in, but he buried everything.
But can we also assume that the ones that he took for propaganda or for the ID?
Yeah, we have some. They're not very. They've been very difficult to read because some of them have been badly deteriorated. We have maybe about 10 or 11 of them, but it's hard. I've been trying to see if I can read the names and to determine who they are, but so far I haven't been very successful. And even if I do find a name, they're often handwritten so the ink has spread. And so that's been a kind of difficult thing to...
Thank you for restoring what you have. It's amazing.
Yeah. How did the Ontario Museum end up with this collection?
I was working at a place in London, England called the Archive of Modern Conflict, and they have it's an archive that collects essentially photographs that have to do with disasters and war conflicts in World War I and World War II. And we were very interested in looking at our collection in terms of developing a collection that showed not only the canonized photographers like Stieglitz and Steichen and so forth, but really look into how is photography used? I mean, what does photography do in a larger world? And I had much interest in a collection which called the Klinsky Archive, which we acquired, and that looked at Europe in the 1930s, and it sort of ended in 1940. And when I was at the archive, I came across a binder that had modern prints sort of put in. They didn't show what we call the rebate around the negative. They were just the images. And I was flipping through it, and I said, and they were so powerful in many ways. And as I was going, there were no particular sequence in there either. And I asked the curator there, Timothy Pruce, what is this? And he said, oh, this is photographs that we've acquired of Lodz Ghetto. And we're working on a book on that, so you can't have them. And they're doing a book called the Lodz Album. And I kind of came back to Toronto, said to our director, Matthew Teitelbaum, that, I saw this body of work that I think is so important, and it continues on from 39, 40, what happens when Europe, falls under Hitler's regime. And I said it would be something that we would want. So there was a silence for about a year or so, and then the Archive of Modern Conflict got in touch with our director, and my director comes and tells me, Maya, the photographs that you're interested in, there's a possibility, but you know what? They're mostly negatives. It's 3,000 negatives and only about, 340 actual photographs. And what are we going to do with that? Because you can't exhibit negatives. I mean, they're reversal, they're small. These are 35 millimeter. As you all know, they're tiny, like, little slides. And so if we take this in, what is our responsibility be to this collection? So I gave it some thought, and I said, well, we have to do an exhibition. We have to show this material. We have to write about it. We have to do a book about it. I think this is the attention it needs, and this way we can disseminate this material into the larger public awareness, that we don't necessarily have to show every picture as a vintage picture, that we can in fact show them as they are, as negatives, which you see in this exhibition, and they're just simply pinned up on the wall. They're not enhanced with frames and so forth. The pictures that you see frames are mostly the original pictures, because they do have a kind of a factor in there of time exposures and fragility and so on. But the larger part of the collection, as you can see, is a negative form, and so we are showing some of the negatives, and I think this is one way of distributing them for people to look at. So we are the custodians of this collection. It was gifted to us by the Archive of Modern Conflict.
So going back to the technical aspects, certainly taking the photos, getting the film was very difficult, but do we know how he developed those negatives?
Well,
getting the chemicals and the darkness and so on.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, Rumkowski set up a photo studio. It started as the statistics department, and then from the statistics department came out this photo studio, because he wanted the productivity of the ghetto photographed. So there was a dark room, the early picture that I showed of these 5 people that worked in there, and they had chemistry and chemicals in there. So I think he worked with whatever was salvaged and whatever he could. It became such a chaos in 1944 in the ghetto. So nobody was paying attention, so he was able to keep on developing. Certainly he was able to develop his pictures taken from of the trains and the people sent off to the gas chambers.
As someone who has been married to a child of a Holocaust survivor for over 50 years, your talk was very important and has certain poignancy. I I have had a lifelong time to view many, many photographs of the Holocaust. This gives me a different view in 2017, because there are some photographs that have stimulated in me something that I hadn't thought about for a while. The one, for instance, is the Jewish council picture, with the men sitting behind a desk as if everything was orderly and things were going on as business. And it says to me how easily, because of the way our minds are set that things will be better, that you're lulled into this type of complacency and magical thinking. So I hope that this exhibit brings out a lot of people, to start people thinking about how easily it is to be lulled. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. I do appreciate your remarks, and I think that you're absolutely right that there is this way of wanting to create an illusion for you, but it's also through illusion that some people survive on a daily basis. And so you can't condemn them. I mean, I certainly can't condemn people for wanting to have the will to survive. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it is the irony of it. I mean, the ultimate irony of these negatives is that, you know, while they were buried and they revealed to us the story of Lodz Ghetto, we have actually buried them into a deep freeze because they're going to deteriorate in order to preserve them. They're in a deep freeze. So there's a lot of irony in many situations. I cannot imagine trying to live in that type of a situation without having some hope for the next day. And whether it was the right thing for people to pose that way or not, it's only they can, I mean, that's their memory. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it reveals a lot, and I think it's important that we continue to question and look at these images, you know, like what do we see and what is it that we don't see? I think it's a very important question. And I think, and one of the things that also we have to remember, that a lot of the pictures that came out of Germany at the time were actually photographed by the perpetrators. So people like Genevieve and people like who did these huge documentaries of Jews had a very different way of photographing the Jews. I mean, to show them that, you know, they were unworthy individuals in every sense, showed them being taunted, having their beards cut off when you were religious, having their coats shredded. You know, the endurance is was amazing of the survival. And to have, I think, Ross's representation that, you know, this was a group of people in the Lodz Ghetto that showed, I think, the resilience and the resistance, I think, in a very different way, which was to have, I think, the kind of a faith that we see in the Torah picture of the man standing up on the rubble and say, you know, make it a good one, make it a good picture of me, so that'll be remembered the right way.
Does Ross comment about why he thinks his life was spared and why he lived and was not sent to his death?
Yeah. He is very clear about it. He didn't do hard labor, so he was better physically fit. I mean, he was emaciated in the last pictures I see of him, but anybody that physically was in a better shape was kept to do what they call the commando, the cleanup commando. And so it was that, you know, he had been spared by doing photography, which was not physical labor. If you had done physical labor, you know, you were worn out, your body was pretty much broken in many ways. So it was because of his fitness, if you want to call it that.
Okay, this is our last question.
Thank you. I want to just follow up on the comment before, because I've been married to a daughter of two survivors of the ghetto. And there's one picture that you had of the fire brigade that I wonder if you could show again, because I know that my father-in-law was a member of the fire brigade. And I thought I saw his image there for a moment, but I'm not sure.
I have to go back quite a bit, but it's worth doing, for sure.
There was another, is that the picture of the fire brigade?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's the only one? I thought there was another one.
Yeah, we have other pictures of the fire brigade, but not here on this. I can, if you leave your contact, I can go through the
That would be wonderful if you could do that.
I can
Thank
go
you.
through the film that we have that photographs the fire brigade. There are other pictures of them, actually running forward. I think there's another one. There's a different view in the book or in the catalog.
Thank you.
So if you leave me your name, I will. I can't do it immediately. I have students to deal with who are writing thesis papers, but I'll do it as soon as I can.
Thank you all so much for coming today. And thank you to Maya.